We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you guys for joining today. I am Sam Becker, our Director of Marketing here at Insane Cyber. And today we're kicking off a new series called OT Office Hours, which is where our team is going to be discussing something OT related. And then we'll also be taking any questions that you might have about working in OT cybersecurity, problems, challenges, anything is on the table. So to start today, our team's going to be talking about tabletop exercises, and then we're going to open the floor to questions. You can submit your questions to me through the Q&A function, or feel free to send them over to me in the chat, and then I will field them to our speakers towards the later half of this call. So for those of you who may not know, Insane Cyber is a innovative cybersecurity vendor. We work in the OT and IT spaces. We have products and services that are designed to help protect critical infrastructure. So our flagship product, Valkyrie, is a forensics automation software that takes your host and network data looking for threats and allows you to quickly respond. Signet is our Valkyrie kit in a hardware flyaway kit. And then on the services side of our business, we have Corvus, which is our managed services, and then Asir, which is our professional services. So those are both retainer-based services that can help you with threat hunting, detection, triage, and response. So really, really customizable and flexible to whatever your team needs. So today we are joined by Dan Gunter, our CEO and founder, and then Markus Mueller, our Director of Managed and Professional Services. I will go ahead and turn it over to them to get started.
Yeah, thanks for joining everyone. My name is Dan Gunter, CEO and founder of Insane Cyber. Excited y'all could join us here, whether you're watching live or watching the recording of this. As Sam mentioned, this is a series we'll do on different topics. So if you have a topic idea or you want to see something, we're also open to suggestions. Markus, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah, definitely. Markus Mueller, Director of Management Professional Services, and joined Insane Cyber. Have a pretty large background, and especially in today's topic. I come from the energy space, where tabletop exercises are really common. It's a requirement for NERC CIP regulation, and it's kind of been pushed quite a bit by others in the same space. And so it's a topic I care a lot about, and it's nice to kind of walk through it with y'all. We have about, I'd say 10, 15 minutes of slides to kind of cover, set some background, and then, submit questions to Sam and she'll get it. We'll answer those kind of near the end. But it is meant to be interactive, and we want to answer everybody's questions. I know, before I got involved in tabletops, I had to do a bunch of research and read a bunch of, CISA or DOE documents on how best to run them. And that's not always the most fun thing when you're reading those white papers on end. So kind of, to start off with, what is a tabletop exercise? And it's a type of scenario. It's interactive. It's discussion led. It's not involving any kind of actual activity. So you're not hands-on keyboard. You're not, looking through things. We'll talk about some other exercise types that I think have a lot of value. The tabletop exercise, I think, has the lowest bar, and it can really be that starting place for a lot of people. The big thing about it, a tabletop exercise, it's meant to practice your response. So, I've run a ton of these. I think I'm close to 100 tabletops I've run throughout my career. Some of them are really small, it can be a small group, single group responders. And sometimes it's an entire organization. My largest ones was around 400 people involving an entire organization, including external parties, government. I've been involved in some larger ones like GridX, which are really cool to do. But the idea with all of those is still to practice your response plans, to run through that and kind of to build that muscle memory and to find issues, to have that kind of activity.
Yeah, and something I'll say on that too. It's interesting with tabletops. Oftentimes, the ones that I've been involved in, I've also been involved in a bunch, both on the commercial side and when I was Air Force, I was actually an exercise planner. So I was involved in the planning of just massive, tens to hundreds of millions of dollar exercises involving thousands of people. And so, some of those were tabletops, some of those were more simulations as Marcus gets into, but what's interesting is with the tabletop, to Marcus's point, it can be really focused down to maybe, a specific plan or a specific part of the operation, or you can do it actually at the full organization level. What's interesting that I always like on them is that it also forces you to, to Marcus's point, to get the dust off of plans that folks might have had to either check the checkbox and haven't looked at it, or to actually make sure people know that they're part of a plan. Commonly on tabletop exercises, you'll invite people or you'll interact with people that have no clue they're part of the plan. And that can be dangerous because at least you're doing it during the tabletop and it's not irrelevant. And last thing I'll say on that is in the Air Force, like, when we were doing tabletops on certain things at the CERT, we would hit parts of our checklist, part of what we were doing where it was like, hey, is it time to wake up a 2-star general at 2 a.m., knowing that folks between us and them would get that call. So tabletops are important both for that technical side and operational side. But the coordination side is where a lot of the magic happens.
Yeah, I would definitely say, and the larger exercises are fun. Multi-day or huge groups of people. It's kind of interesting. They get simpler from like what's happening because you're involving so many people. But that smaller size, I'm a huge fan of, especially for folks starting out. And we'll kind of talk about the types. I kind of break tabletops into kind of who's involved and what the outcomes are. And it's, that technical operational exercise, those are the people who are boots on the ground. They're getting that call when there's an HMI in a plant that has a ransomware screen on it. They're getting that call when a system goes down and people are trying to figure out what's going on. That can be your technical folks, your cybersecurity folks, your incident responders, if your forensics folks, if you have them. It can also be your plant personnel. I'm a huge fan of bringing both of those teams together to do the exercises. A lot of those type of events are going to be, right of boom. And when we say that, there's a triggering event like a ransomware screen, that's considered a boom. You have a clear event. You can do ones with technical teams that are usually left of boom. And those would be, where they may, have alerts that come up or activity they capture with their security tools ahead of time, or on like the engineering side. If pieces of equipment are going down or there's maintenance issues, sometimes that can be an indication of an adversary being in that environment. A lot of times within ICS, within the industrial world, we see adversaries having to test capabilities before they can actually deploy because everything's a little bit different in these environments. And an SEL in one substation is going to be different than an SEL in another substation, the way it's programmed. And so sometimes you have to change the attack for that. So that's where we see that. Kind of the next layer up from that is that crisis management. This is usually when you start looking at those like middle managers, those folks that are going to be, getting that call. A lot of times at this crisis management level, we're dealing with some different parties. Sometimes we'll deal with third parties. Sometimes you'll have vendors involved. And that's really more about how the organization is going to respond. The technical folks are still usually involved to some extent because they're answering questions, but it's more them answering questions for the team that's managing the event itself. And kind of that final level, and this has become really popular because of some new regulations around the Securities and Exchange Commission, kind of the requirements around that. So executive level tabletops. And this is really how senior leadership responds to an event. And you can kind of think of this as one feeding up to the other. I've done a series of tabletops before for a single organization where we did operational and technical. And the outcome of that was fed up to a crisis management exercise and then finally to an executive level. And they kind of feed into each other and different folks are looking at different things. The core capabilities that you're looking or you're testing, in your technical operational is going to be that incident response plan, that operational continuity plan, or that disaster recovery plan for a plant, versus crisis management plans, operational communication plans, or organizational communication plans, I should say. And then at that executive level, it's really how executives manage the event, and it's usually has to do with leadership. It has to do with communication with boards. Is there regulatory compliance requirements around that, and notifications, and those are kind of much different things.
And the other thing I'll say on this, to Marcus's point, is often, so right, there are three different types here. At the same type, like you can run some of these hybrid, you never want to boil the ocean, and especially like, depending on how much prep time you have, how much resources you're actually putting into this, it's possible to do an exercise at kind of one or more of these layers. But even if you do it one layer, something I recommend based on what we've seen in the past is you can have a technical and operational exercise and bring in some of the exec side, right? Vice versa, you can bring the other side in. Because oftentimes, like, right, I've been an incident responder for quite a long time, quite a lot. People make assumptions on how processes work. And so again, getting back to the magic of getting people together, sometimes like breaking down that wall and being like, hey, this is how this level makes decisions, or hey, this is how this goes on. Again, when you actually get to an incident, or when you get to a situation where you activate it, there's more faith between levels because people understand where others are coming from. And again, you have that not just working relationship, but a level of trust and respect. And so from the person level and from the technical level, there's a lot of value kind of in thinking how you break these tabletops down, and then again, how you expose kind of the outcome of this. Markus, have you seen kind of the same? What's been your experience there?
Yeah, no, definitely. I do, if it's an early maturity or early journey organization, it's usually very small group focused, but I do like to have, if we can get some leadership, even observing, if they're not involved in the exercise, I do think there's a ton of value in bringing that across the board. One of the kind of best moments I've ever had, I was doing an executive tabletop with an organization that had done another one that was kind of a hybrid beforehand. And the executive leadership asked, point blank to the plant manager, like, how long is this recovery going to take? And the plant manager, rightly said, we figure it's going to take about a week to 3 weeks, depending on if we can get everything done right and everything like that. And the executive was like, well, our plans say 2 days. So we have a big delta. It was like that aha moment where you realize that delta, and it wasn't a critical moment for, nobody was getting blamed for it. It's just the realities of, one group assumes one thing and one group assumes another. And it's, bridging that gap can be huge. And that organization ended up putting a lot of effort towards figuring out, how to decrease that time and how to have supply chain, stay stable throughout, because they were a manufacturing facility. And so they were trying, had to figure some of those things out. As I kind of mentioned, exercise rules, I mentioned observers. Participants are those ones that are actively involved. When you choose your participants, depending on what scenario you have, I really do recommend, making sure the participants are going to be the ones that are responding at that level or involved in that level. So if it's, engineering folks, if it's operations, if it's a plant, for example, you're going to want those folks. You're probably going to want some plant leadership. And then you'll want the technical folks that support them. And then, the responders. Observers should not participate. We've all, I'm sure, Dan, you've done these enough to have that observer that keeps speaking up, and you kind of have to tamp them down a little bit. But your observers are really there just to watch. They're there to learn. I try to not have them participate and try to table any of that conversation. And then the facilitators are those who manage it. Their entire job is to make sure that the exercise flows. They're there to answer questions and kind of help everybody along. So common scenarios too, I will say, I've run some weird exercises in the past, and there's always the, like oddball things that folks ask for. The major one that I think most organizations are at risk of is going to be ransomware. I mean, most organizations are facing that threat. When developing a scenario, and we'll walk through kind of the process we go through, but you do want to kind of pick a scenario that fits your organization. For most organizations, that's going to be ransomware, and it does matter. The scenario is going to drive who's involved. If you're dealing with destructive malware, that may be a different group being involved. If you start getting into industrial espionage or some of the geopolitical things, you may have to call in different parties, both from a government or from a legal perspective or compliance. You do want to take all those into account. Some are easier to kind of respond to, some are harder. I would say insider threat is one of the hardest ones that you see teams struggle with. It's just a hard thing to respond to. So it's a good one to kind of put in your in your journey when you've maybe run a tabletop or two.
The other thing I'll say on this, for common scenarios, so a lot of these are cybersecurity focused, from kind of the cyber threat focus. The other area I definitely recommend going in also is, because we are in OT, because we do run control systems for a lot of the customers that we work with, they're responsible for a lot of that. Also taking kind of a, consequence-driven approach, taking a more architectural, hey, this is how a GE gas turbine works, or this is how, Honeywell Experion or Yokogawa CNMVP works. And what I mean by that, right, is, when WannaCry happened, a lot of people were kind of left in a place to where they're like, hey, how do we handle this SMB, rapidly spreading SMB vuln? Well, it was known for a long time in the operating manuals that it's very hard to run Honeywell Experion without SMB between certain subnets and certain software components that do bridge kind of Purdue layers, right? And so, breaking down your control system, knowing, hey, I know my control system requires this traffic, between these zones or between these plants. We've even seen, as we've gone out on scenarios and looked at plants being like, hey, country X has a plan in it, and that has a SMB trust connection to a plan in country Y, right? And so going in both with a little understanding of how your network runs, the actual operational layer on that, and kind of playing what's if, right? Some people will say like, hey, some of that's a little bit theoretical. At the same time, you want to look out for some of those possible situations, right? Because they are very possible. Like, right, WannaCry did have a massive impact with an SMB vuln, right? There's a whole lot of other risky stuff at the plant level that has to get allowed because that's just how the stuff is engineered. And so working through and knowing those scenarios is key, and working with both the engineering teams. If you're on the cybersecurity side, working close to the engineering folks to understand. I mean, I've even been at refineries to where we had Yokogawa right next to us. We had Honeywell right next to us, so we could be like, hey, is this how this is actually supposed to work? And they're like, yeah, that is. And it's like, okay, there's some good scenarios just from, interacting kind of down at the plant with the engineers and understanding what's there, right? Because, a way to not be popular is to just be the security person that tries to tell people no, right? And in this space, you won't get a lot of push. But coming in with that, like, that's another really good scenario area. I'm curious, Markus, I bet you've done some tabletops down that path, haven't you?
Yeah, a lot of them, a lot more in the utility space and generation space, where we're looking at really consequence driven. Some in the manufacturing, pharmaceutical actually is an interesting one that we've done, where we're looking at consequence. And pharmaceutical is an interesting one just because quality control is like the biggest thing in manufacturing process there, and they'll run batches, and batch shutdown isn't their problem. Is the quality there? We have to be able to track it through good management or good manufacturing processes all the way through. And so some of those type scenarios are a lot of fun to do. And it matters less kind of what's impacting that process, is more like what the impact is.
Yeah, and we've known too, and this is where some insider knowledge can come into because we've known like I can't out which protocol. We've known certain industrial protocols go into certain industrial assets to where if you send a certain number of function code communications, you can actually push a device into requiring maintenance, and they have to bring the device offline. And so, again, getting down into the OT specific stuff and some of the cool engineering and physics side of it, those make great tabletop exercises because oftentimes on your IT or on your OT cybersecurity side, not all folks understand that, and especially if you have engineers in the room when you're like, hey, if I do this a bunch of times, that causes a maintenance outage, right? And they're like, yeah, but we haven't seen that. And it's like, okay, hey, that would be a fun exercise to put, not as a gotcha, but be like, okay, what are you going to do? Because like your engineering team's convinced this is that it will lead to this outcome. So
Yeah, a lot of those too are kind of that left of boom as I was talking
yeah,
about.
yeah.
I really enjoy those because it is a lot of those type of events engineering sees first and maintenance. And their processes are, oh, I've got a sensor down, I'm going to go replace IO, or I'm going to go replace this device because one fails every 6 months, and then all of a sudden you have three fail. You like, does that trigger any kind of investigation? Those type of things are a lot of fun to do.
My favorite are the RTUs to where like there is some RTUs to where it's like you have 10 TCP IP connections to them still, and like it'll overflow the device. And so
Oh yeah.
again, you never throw gotchas, but sometimes there's fun where it's like, hey, what type of RTU do you have? Okay, hey, let me show you something.
Yeah, and I'll kind of walk you through like our exercise engagement flow. I definitely would recommend something similar. This has been kind of refined over a lot of exercises that I've done. That planning meeting is really just that kickoff, understanding who's going to be involved, what type you're doing. Then it's information and documentation review. A lot of this is like Dan was talking about, understanding the environment. Looking at, hey, do I have this type of PLC? Do I have this type of RTU? How does that industrial process work? And some of it is going down all the way to the level of like what's possible. So if a system has a mechanical blow off valve, overpressure valve in the system that stops a certain pressure going off and stops process from being unsafe, you're not going to be able to make it unsafe from cyber. And those are hopefully built in. That's good engineering practices, consequence driven engineering. And you have to understand that if you're going to write a scenario that has an outcome like that. Definitely understanding the threat landscape. If I'm running a scenario for an electric utility, that's a much different scenario than I'm running for a manufacturing pharmaceutical. Like those are much different, or high tech manufacturing. And then using that to develop the material. When we talk about the material, it's developing those timelines, developing those injects, and we'll go more into that a bit. And it's that exercise execution, and this is where a facilitator is so important. I will say, as I said, I've done a bunch of these. Dan's done a bunch. You kind of hone your facilitator brain for it, and if it's almost like if you ever played Dungeons and Dragons when you were a kid, if you're that dungeon master, you kind of have to control the story to some extent. And the timeline and all the background information you have will help with that. But somebody's going to ask a question and you've got to make a decision and kind of come up with an answer for them, give them that, and track it and make sure it flows with the story. And sometimes I see folks miss is kind of that after the event. So you run the exercise, and we create an after action report. We talk through with the participants. We do lessons learned, and then if needed, we do an improvement plan. But I see a lot of people run exercises and that's the end of it. And really, to me, that's it's 75% of it. That last 25 where you're really getting those lessons learned is important, because you want to keep improving. You want to take those lessons learned and kind of push them forward.
Yeah, and a good facilitator, and I know on the next slide we'll hit some exercise material and slide after how to be successful, but a lot as you get into this engagement flow, this is where really a good facilitator and an experienced facilitator is going to meet you both where you're at from a maturity side. And so I've done tabletops with super mature groups that know their stuff in and out. That's very rare. Most tabletops are with kind of low to medium maturity that we've seen. And so, when you get into both engagement flow, when you get into this, a good facilitator is both going to tailor it for you. And that's why it's important to have someone with experience that has been down into plants, has done some of this. Like, right, we even have junior folks we like pushing out onto these to train them, right? But it's really hard to throw a junior person into a exercise or someone that doesn't have some of that operational or tie to do it. You're kind of setting that person up for failure, right? So as you get into this, as you get into injects, as you get into timeline artifacts, all the materials that go in, and Markus will talk about these in a second, yes, the resources on these are absolutely limited. You want to make sure the outcomes that you're aiming for, you have that prioritized list to hit. But as you're resourcing these, like, again, working with a sophisticated group on this or making sure you're resourcing it the right way, this is how you're actually going to scale it to be effective. Markus, I'll turn it over to you.
Yeah. Yeah. And exercise material, creating a background, understanding, how you're going to set the stage for that scenario. A lot of times when we're introing people to the scenario, all the participants in the room, or we're doing it remotely, we're setting the stage. Hey, this is what's happening, kind of, this is what's going on. We'll set a bit of background, give them some information to kind of start the story. We kind of define a timeline. You can run exercises in real time. Done that before. You can also run it accelerated. Hey, I'm doing a 4-hour exercise, 4 hours of playtime, but actually I've got 10 injects over, a 3-week period, because things take time, and so you want to be realistic about that. And we've mentioned injects a lot. Injects are just the events that happen in the scenario. So traditionally, for most exercises, I've done a lot more, but traditionally you want to be somewhere around that 5 to 10 injects for a normal size half day exercise. And with those injects, we tend to create artifacts. It kind of helps people. That can be screenshots, that can be alert outputs, it can be pictures, it can be videos. I've done very elaborate artifacts, especially not tabletops, but when you start getting into the full-blown exercises, hands-on keyboards, that's when artifacts really are important. But it does help folks. I will also say, as a facilitator, and Dan, I'm sure you've done the same thing, is I've walked in the room with 10 injects and on the fly cutting injects or adding injects. And that's the scary bit, because something doesn't work, and you kind of have to be ready for that. It's kind of the storyline. And then the last thing for material is that I really like to walk folks through what actually happened. It kind of allows folks, 5-10 minutes of hey, here's the other side of it. Here's all the stuff you saw, you saw an HMI go down, or you saw a virus alert, or an alert on, your EDR, or your EDR blue screened your computer. What happened on the back end, and that's kind of at the end, it helps folks kind of, link pieces together.
Yeah, and to that point, injects are a good thing. I was talking about scaling these and getting these at the right level. As a facilitator and someone that's facilitated these, to Markus's point, sometimes you enter a room and the material and everything is right on the level of the audience because you've done your homework and you actually hit it right. But the truth is, a lot of rooms you walk into, and kind of as a facilitator, you hit this level where you're okay, oh, they're really strong here and they don't know this side at all, right? And so in that, you end up with those injects, with Markus's point of changing them on the fly, you end up kind of, I don't say hand-holding, you end up crawling a little longer on a crawl, walk, run on certain areas. Because again, education is a good outcome of these. Other rooms I walked into, everyone's been super advanced, and then you just do start throwing more curveballs at them. And oftentimes as a facilitator, what's cool is if you're actually doing these to your company, or if you're facilitating, you actually learn a ton from them too, where it's I would have never thought about solving that inject that way. It sounds like a legitimate way to do it. And so, hey, let's let that fly. And so, to that, from the crawl, walk, run, there's both a lot of scaling to maturity and then again to time. that you can do with injects. You don't want to shove a bunch of injects into a really small time window because you won't have kind of that quality level of outcome. But you do want to make sure the injects again hit to the right audience at the right level. With this too, we've also done exercises to where we've started out kind of at a crawl level. A day or two later, it ended up in walk, and a day or two later ended up in run. And so, you don't necessarily have to run a whole tabletop at the same sophistication level. It can actually ramp up, and it's very common in the ones. Or the other cool thing is if you're doing these kind of in a sequence, or you have a strategy from tabletop to tabletop, you can also ramp that way as the relationship grows. Because the advantage of having someone you work with kind of regularly on these is they get to know you. And the more that, like, especially if you're engaging someone on the outside, the more they know about your specific operations, the better it's going to be, right? Um, and certainly, like we said, there's ways to be like, okay, hey, you're using this control system, you're using this PLC. I can write a generic one for that, but to that point, the chaining and the working together, engagement to engagement, you get to some really good outcomes. What have you seen on that, Marcus? I'm curious.
Yeah, I've there's a couple folks I've worked with, where I've done 10 or 11 tabletops with them, and it's kind of it's you start to learn their responses. Like the scenario changes and evolves, different sites. I mean, it wasn't the same site over and over again. It's a very large company, Fortune 50, and so they have a lot of sites. We test different teams around the globe. We knew some of their responses, and you start doing things like taking key folks out of it. You start tabling certain folks, and kind of the difficulty level goes up, because the point is to kind of get folks into that. If all they're doing is reading through the plan and know how to execute it, it's an awesome place to be. But you do want them to start thinking past the plan sometimes. I really enjoy those. Have you done many open book ones? Because I've only done a few open book. I've always kind of pushed against it.
Yeah, and give us the definition of it real quick.
So open book is just where like you share all the injects in the entire timeline at the beginning, and then the team kind of responds. Yeah.
Most of ours have been closed or most of the ones I've been in on have been closed. I could see an advantage that way. I could also see to where sometimes that fog of war, that element of surprise, adds a whole lot to it. And yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm a bigger fan of closed personally, but it depends on the maturity. Very like beginning, sometimes it's a little easier to do an open, or kind of almost more like a workshop, incident response workshop versus like a true tabletop. Things I will say to be successful. You need to reference a plan. Like if you're at the stage where you don't have an incident response plan, you shouldn't be doing a tabletop. You can do incident response workshops, and I've run those before, where we do an incident response. We create an incident response plan with an organization or with a team, and we'll use a template and we'll create it for them specifically. And then at the kind of through that process, we'll also then test it with a small TTX, kind of run through it. But that's more kind of the open book set. If you don't have a plan, TTXs aren't the right thing. This isn't for like the process you're trying to perfect is the response process. You don't want individual answers necessarily driving those, because it's a team effort. Including the right participants, making sure, as we've talked about a bunch, making sure that you have a diverse set of folks. When I've been involved in incident response, it is always surprising how many different teams and how many different that team, like you show up at the beginning of an incident response event, and you spin up your team, you start getting responders there, you start pulling evidence, and all of a sudden the folks you're dealing with go from like 5 to like 50 in the span of a few hours. A lot of times it'll shrink back down, but it's one of those things of like, in incident response, anybody who's going to be involved should be involved in these tabletops as you grow, especially. That set the correct tone. I think this is critical, especially as a facilitator. I want a no blame environment. Incident response is a team effort. We don't want to blame individuals. No idea is a bad idea. is really cheap to fail during a tabletop. Is really, really, really expensive to fail during incident response. Like that could be a company ending event. The wrong event happens, it can ruin a company. It can, be something you can't recover from. And so failing in these exercises is cheap. It's easy comparatively. So there's no wrong answer when we do that, and there's no blame, especially like when we do any of the lessons learned or reported. We always focus on, hey, we're never going to call out a team or a person. It's always, this is what we saw. Here's our recommendations based on it. Making it relevant. Anything's possible. I mean, I've been involved in a tabletop where we started talking about drones and things like that, and those are possible. And the customer wanted us to focus on that. That was kind of their request, but it wasn't very, realistic. It wasn't very possible, and it wasn't really relevant to the threat profile that they had. Involving folks, making it interactive. It shouldn't be just somebody standing there reading off. You have to sometimes prompt people. And it's always, if you've ever done any training, it's that the training thing of the first day you're in training, nobody talks. And by the third day of training, everybody's best friends. You kind of, as a facilitator, have to force that quickly because you want everybody interacting. And especially when there are new folks in the room and traditionally folks that don't interact a lot, something, like cybersecurity folks on the IT side probably have never been to a plant, don't know the engineers, and the engineers don't trust them because their experiences with IT may not have been great. And so those, changing that takes a little bit. Kind of touched on that realistic factor, make sure it fits the organization. Focus on learning and building bridges. I think it's one of the best. I've had tabletops where the response was, it didn't go well. Like they went back and rewrote their incident response plan. But from an organizational standpoint, that was a huge learning. And the ops team had never met the security team. They'd never been in a room together. But they got together after that. And I still talk to some of the folks at that utility. It's a water utility. And they have built that bridge. Now they have a common ground to go, okay, we're going to work together to have good response. I've also seen folks rush through this. And I've made this mistake early on when I was doing tabletop exercises. For a utility I work for, I would schedule an hour. Like, we're going to run through an incident response plan. Here's our exercise. And I realized pretty quickly, you want to schedule enough time. You want enough time for everybody to be able to participate, and you want enough time to do that lesson learned afterwards. Pick the right facilitator, somebody who understands how you're going to respond, understands the organization, somebody who has enough time. Traditionally prepping for I spend way more time, probably 5 to 1 prepping to executing. If it's a half day exercise, I'm spending 2 or 3 weeks leading up to that, making sure we're ready. And then always, again, focus on those process improvements. It's about making the process better. Dan, anything?
Yeah, the one I'll pick on, to the right facilitator, something else I'll encourage is, especially if you're doing a lot of tabletops, make sure to go for some diversity of thought in your facilitator. And so if you're using a single company, like, it's all right to say, hey, can we have just a different facilitator this time around, so we have, a different level of cognitive biases, different level of experience. Because to that facilitator point, it's going to be very different, even from facilitator to facilitator in the same company. Much less, another good recommendation is to, even diversify and choose another vendor to do it, right? So, hey, have vendor X do one, then have vendor Y do one if you really want to isolate that over. Because again, we all come with biases. Everyone comes in with, intentions and perspectives, rightfully or wrongfully so, and they might not actually realize it, right? And so, you don't want to always do the same tabletop to over and over to that point. And sometimes, like, having some facilitator diversity is going to help out there.
Perfect. And we did kind of go, touch on this at the beginning. Tabletops are great. I'm a huge fan of them. kind of the next step beyond that is kind of getting into the interactive space. And we've, interactive exercises where you actually have hands on keyboards, and these aren't production systems. I will be clear. We don't necessarily want to deal with production systems. We're dealing with simulated environments. We're dealing with test systems, and it kind of goes into a couple different things. Interactive exercises that may be, where we're giving somebody artifacts. Hey, here's logs, go and look at them. Or we're going to go through and hand you, like, forensics is the classic example. I want you to do a memory image analysis on this. Let's try to isolate and scope, and create some IOCs for this malware. Those tend to be much longer and more focused, but they tend to be of a huge benefit because it's a training opportunity. You get to walk through those processes with folks. Simulated attack exercises, these tend to be on the side of, hey, we have a simulated attack. How do we recover? Or how do we defend against that attack actively? The great example I've been involved in is where we literally did a full restore of a control center. We had all the backups, we ran through the backups, went through the entire process. That was a simulated attack that had taken down, a system, and we walked through what it would take to stand it all the way back up. Learned a lot, and it was really informative. But that process is, that can span multiple days, it can span multiple weeks to kind of run through that. It takes a lot of effort, but it can pay off quite a bit. And then the final one is that red team, blue team exercise, where you've got an active team that's attacking you, and this is what your blue team's going to see, and how you respond to those. And, there's benefits on all these. These are, they have much higher cost from a time and resource perspective, but they can be of a huge benefit. But it's kind of beyond. Once you've kind of done a fair number of tabletops and you have good response procedures, then you want to start to look at these type of things. I know a lot of folks will jump right in. Hey, I want to do a red team, blue team exercise, and they haven't done a tabletop before. And we'll usually advise them, like, hey, let's focus on response first, and then we'll get there. Well, here's our path to get you there on the journey. I think we have some questions, Sam.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. That was a lot of really good information. So, kicking off some of the Q&A that came through, you guys talked a bit about how important the facilitator is. So a question that we got is, do I have to have somebody from outside of my organization run this for me? Is that a necessity?
Yeah, I can take that one. You don't have to have someone from the outside. There are benefits to having someone a little farther from the problem, especially if you're part of the process. It can make it kind of weird if you're actually looped into the process on certain things. So you don't have to. There's benefits both ways.
Yeah, I would agree. I also, like, as I said, I've done a lot of these, and it's a learned skill. I look back at some of the early exercises I ran, and I probably wasn't as good of a facilitator as I am now, and I'm continuing to learn. I actually really enjoy shadowing other people's tabletops and kind of seeing how other facilitators do it. I think you can do it internally, but the amount of value or the quality of the facilitator is probably not going to be at the same level, just because it's a learned skill. Once you've done 20, 50, 100 of these, it's much different than if you do one once a year, which is, what most organizations are, good organizations. I've seen some organizations doing one a quarter. That's about the highest cadence I've seen. And that's a decently large organization.
Another question that we've got is, what's a common mistake that people make when they run their first tabletop? I know you mentioned kind of confidence and assuming that they were going to take less time, but are there other mistakes that people run into?
I think overstuffing the schedule is one big one. I would say another is just preparedness. Some people underestimate the level of preparedness, and especially if you don't have a process to build those. Building a scenario can be somewhat complicated and very hard. And then people will get flustered right when folks start poking holes in their scenarios, right? And so there is a significant amount of prep that can go into them, and to the point of realism. that realism is super important, both from if you go in with a non-realistic scenario or an overstuffed scenario, you're going to end up either with people ending up being a whole lot skeptical coming out if it wasn't a good one, or it just kind of falling apart. And so, again, making sure you have the right team, making sure you have the right prep structure there, that's going to be key. Marcus, what else do you think on that?
Yeah, I think the amount of preparation, I see folks getting really complex too. It's if you're going to run an internal tabletop and it's, you're early in the journey and hey, I just created an OT specific incident response plan. I just have a couple of responders that, want to involve a small team. Like it doesn't have to be 10 injects. It can be 4 injects. It can be something simple like, hey, we lost a system. How do we recover? It can be, you can start off slow. I'll also say there's a ton of good resources out there for, material. And there's a ton of large scenarios that take place. The largest would be GridX in the electric industry. That happens every other year. Those, just because the material's there, as Dan said, you still end up spending a bunch of time prepping. When we did GridX, for example, we usually spent 6 months, 9 months prepping for GridX, which sounds like a long time, but if you're not dedicated to that, even if you're spending 10 hours a week, which is what we kind of were doing, you still, there's a lot you have to do to make it fit your environment and how you're going to play those large scale scenarios.
Sure. So you talked about different groups kind of being brought together in tabletop exercises that may not typically work together. And I know you mentioned that there's this, you kind of have to build a camaraderie and trust between people. So do you have any tips on how to kind of quickly build up that trust between teams so that people do start working together quickly in those scenarios when they maybe don't know each other or haven't worked together or there's distrust?
For me, it's, a lot of it comes at the beginning. I try to set the tone very clearly. I try to be very upfront about, hey, this is what we're here to do, and just be very frank about the environment we're creating for the scenario. And part of it, I will say, is asking questions, engaging different teams. I will make sure everybody in the room is involved. This is much easier when you do them in person. In-person tabletops tend to be of higher value, I think. Done a lot during COVID, a lot remote, but you can involve a lot of folks. It's reading body language, seeing who's getting comfortable, and then I would say anytime there's kind of any kind of if there's any kind of blame or any kind of like politics start coming into the conversation, you just want to shut that down as nicely as you can. My favorite tool in the world for that is the parking lot. And just you can quickly say, hey, let's parking lot that item, and we'll talk about it at the end. Whether you have time or not, matters less more than you're just kind of diverting away from that touchy subject. Yeah.
All right. The next question is, are there any free or low cost materials out there if you don't have the budget to do, to bring in a facilitator and you need to do it internally? What kind of resources are there, or how do you get started with that?
Definitely. I would say DOE and CISA are the two main ones. CISA has actually published quite a few packets together out there. I know we have some material coming out soon too, referencing kind of some places you can go. So I think, there's good material out there. And as I said, it doesn't have to be super complex, but the CISA one, I think they probably have like 20 or 30 different scenarios right now out on their site. And they're decent. They set up a nice timeline. They kind of give you all the background information. You'll have to customize it to your environment and make sure that it works. But I think there's some really good stuff out there. There's also a lot of good talks that have been done, that have been posted. If you look at any of the security conferences, a lot of those talks make it onto, YouTube or their site. Dan, you got any on your list that you'd recommend?
There's some, so ICS Village has done some out there. Another note I'll say on the diversity piece for people doing it is there's a lot of opinions on what a good and bad tabletop is out there. So there is a lot of opinions. Especially for the free stuff, you're going to get opinions. And a whole lot of direction on the good and bad. I know pointed out on free is you can have free generic ones. Again, at the same time, the risk you run with it is just it's not going to be as tailored for you. So you'll still get some outcome from it. But there's magic that happens beyond that. So absolutely, there's a lot of free resources. Quality can vary, to Marcus's point on who put it out and how it's maintained.
Great. All right. Well, that is about all of the questions that we've had come in. Again, thank you everyone for joining us. If you have any questions or want to follow up with any of our panelists from today, their contact information is here. I've also included Brad's contact information, who is our director of sales. If you have any questions on how to get started or want to, approach doing a tabletop exercise with the Insane Cyber team. And with that, we will end our first office hour. So thank you everyone for joining. Thanks to Dan and Markus for taking the time today, and we will see you all next month.